When I first bought the sprawling 8,000 square foot lakeside mansion, I didn't imagine my move would immediately turn into some twisted reality show featuring the HOA's most notorious Karen as the uninvited co-star. But here we are. I'd been overseas for 6 months finalizing a property sale in Europe, which meant the mansion, purchased fully furnished, had been sitting empty except for periodic visits from a cleaning service and a groundskeeper. I had told the HOA president, Mr. Campbell, that I would not be moving in until the spring and that any maintenance concerns could be sent to my email, a point I thought was crystal clear. Apparently, vacant translated in Karen's mind to free to occupy like a vacation rental. The moment I pulled into my driveway 2 weeks ahead of schedule, still jet-lagged and running on airplane coffee, I noticed something was off. My security gate, which I always kept padlocked, was swung open, as though welcoming me in. My first thought was maybe the landscapers forgot to close it. Then I noticed 2 cars in the circular driveway, one a white Lexus SUV, the other a beat-up gray minivan plastered with "Support Our Troops" and HOA Proud stickers. My stomach dropped. The Lexus I didn't recognize. The van, however, I'd seen parked across the street from my lot before, belonging to none other than the HOA's own Karen Johnson, a woman known in the neighborhood Facebook group for raging about aesthetic violations and policing kids' lemonade stands. At first I wondered if she had stopped by for HOA business or to snoop, but the pile of Amazon boxes stacked by the front door told a different story. There were more than 10 of them, each addressed to my home, but with her name, and judging by the ripped-open packaging, she'd been enjoying her deliveries without hesitation. My pulse quickened as I grabbed my phone, pulling up the live feed from my security system. That's when my jaw nearly hit the steering wheel. The cameras showed activity inside the house, lights on in multiple rooms, music playing faintly, and a woman in yoga pants and a messy bun dancing around the kitchen with a wine glass in hand like she owned the place. It was Karen. Not only that, but she was wearing one of my monogram bathrobes. I sat in my car for a full minute trying to comprehend the audacity. My front door lock had been changed. Yes, changed, and the keypad entry code had been replaced. I scrolled through the footage and realized she'd been living there for 2 weeks, hosting what looked like wine nights, dragging in overnight guests, and even using my private dock. One clip showed her bragging to a group of women. Though the owner lets me use the place when he's away, which was a bold-faced lie. My first instinct was to call the police immediately, but I knew this was HOA territory, and Karen had deep connections with the board and a tendency to spin stories faster than anyone could fact-check. I decided to walk right in, or at least try. The key I had no longer worked, confirming she had the lock swapped out. I rang the doorbell, and sure enough, she appeared behind the frosted glass, freezing for a moment when she saw me before quickly recovering with a smug smile. She cracked the door open, blocking most of the frame, and said, "Oh, you're back early. You should have told me. I could have had the place cleaned up for you." My voice stayed calm, but my jaw clenched. "Karen, why are you in my house?" She gave a little laugh like I was overreacting. "Well, the HOA noticed the place was sitting empty, and I volunteered to, keep an eye on it. It's not safe for a home to be vacant this long." I told her point blank that she had no right to enter, much less live there, and she immediately switched to the victim role. "You don't have to be so hostile," she sniffed. "Besides, the HOA approved it." I almost laughed. The HOA has no authority to approve strangers moving into my private home. When I tried to step forward, she slid in front of the doorway and said she couldn't let me in until she verified that I was the rightful owner. The absurdity of being locked out of my own house by someone squatting there was almost comical, but I wasn't in the mood for jokes. "Karen," I said slowly, "open the door or I call the police right now." Her eyes narrowed, and that's when she dropped the threat. "You might want to be careful who you threaten. I can have the HOA fine you for harassment." That was it. My patience evaporated. I dialed the local police department on speaker, telling dispatch there was an unauthorized occupant in my home who had changed the locks. Karen tried to interrupt, saying she was house-sitting, But when I asked her to produce any written agreement or permission from me, she clammed up. The dispatcher said officers would arrive shortly, and as soon as I hung up, Karen stormed off into the living room, muttering about how this is going to backfire. While waiting, I walked around the property. She'd moved patio furniture around, her laundry was drying on my balcony railing, and my boat keys were missing from the dock closet. The nerve was staggering. When the officers arrived, Karen immediately tried to flip the narrative, claiming I was an aggressive stranger trying to break in. But I had my purchase documents, ID, and even the camera footage showing her arriving with suitcases 2 weeks ago. That's when her smirk faltered. One officer pulled her aside while the other stayed with me, and I overheard bits of her story unraveling. She admitted the HOA suggested she check in on the place but couldn't explain why she had changed. The locks brought in her own bedding and ordered dozens of packages. The police told her to collect her things and leave immediately or face trespassing charges. Watching her stomp around stuffing clothes into duffel bags, slamming cabinet doors and shooting me dirty looks was oddly satisfying. Still, I had the sinking feeling this wasn't over. Karen didn't strike me as someone who took humiliation well. The OO was going to hear about this, and I suspected she'd spin the story into some tale of her being the neighborhood hero wrongfully accused. I wasn't going to let that happen. As she finally wheeled her suitcase out the door, muttering, "You'll regret this," I knew I had to prepare for a war with the HOA, and I had a plan forming that would make her wish she'd never set foot in my home. The morning after Karen was escorted from my mansion, I woke up still running on the fumes of disbelief and adrenaline from the night before. But there was no time to waste. If I knew anything about HOA politics, it was that the narrative can flip faster than a pancake at a charity breakfast, and I was not about to let her spin this into some heroic rescue mission gone wrong. My first stop was the security system console, where I downloaded every second of the footage from the last month onto a secure hard drive every wine night. Every shopping spree delivery, every dock party she hosted like she owned the place. I also noticed something interesting. There were gaps in the recording. Small, carefully timed windows where the cameras were switched off. That meant she had been in my security system menu, and when I checked the logs, there it was. 2 weeks ago, her email had been added to the authorized device list. That was the first real clue this wasn't some casual house-sitting mistake. She'd planned it. I also found a string of texts from the cleaning service sent during my absence saying they'd been told by the new tenant to skip their visits because she had it covered. The number given was Karen's. With evidence stacking up, I reached out to my attorney, Mark, who nearly spit his coffee out when I told him the story. "This isn't just trespassing," he said. "This is unlawful occupancy, possible identity fraud. And if the HOA knowingly backed her, they're in deep trouble." That was the line I wanted to pursue. I didn't just want her out. I wanted her and the board cornered so thoroughly that they couldn't wiggle out of accountability. Before I could even finish my first cup of coffee, my phone buzzed with an email from the HOA, subject line, "Urgent, misunderstanding regarding temporary home occupancy." The body was a masterpiece of vague corporate nonsense, essentially claiming Karen was acting in good faith to protect community property values while my home was unattended, and that the lock change was unfortunate but necessary. Necessary for what? Hosting a wine club? They suggested a mediation meeting to resolve the misunderstanding. I didn't reply. Instead, I printed the email and added it to my growing stack of evidence. Around noon, I decided to pay a friendly visit to a few neighbors, people I suspected might have been at her gatherings. Sure enough, one retired couple across the street admitted they'd seen a lot of cars in my driveway and had even attended one of her so-called HOA socials at my house, under the impression I had given permission. She said you were friends and you'd offered her the place while you were away, the wife said sheepishly. I showed them a copy of my travel schedule and laughed it off, but inside my blood was boiling. This wasn't just opportunism, this was a full-scale impersonation campaign. That evening, I took a stroll through the neighborhood with my phone in hand, pretending to chat while actually recording audio. When I passed the small HOA park, I caught Karen holding court with a few residents, loudly telling them I'd come home early and flipped out without giving her a chance to explain, painting herself as the victim of a paranoid, absentee homeowner. Perfect. That was slander. In front of witnesses, and I had it all recorded. By the third day, my attorney had prepared a preliminary cease and desist for both Karen and the HOA, warning them of legal action if they continued to misrepresent the situation or enter my property without consent. But I wanted more than a warning. I wanted them squirming. So I took the story to the county sheriff's office, who were far less sympathetic to HOA hero narratives. The deputy I spoke with actually laughed when I played the footage of her sipping wine in my robe. "She's lucky you didn't press burglary charges," he said. "That lock change alone is criminal." He advised me to file a formal complaint, which I did, knowing that the paper trail would be my best weapon when the HOA inevitably tried to bury the incident. Sure enough, that same afternoon, I received a second HOA email, this one far less diplomatic, accusing me of harassing a valued board member. Yes, apparently Karen had a seat on the board and creating an unsafe environment. They also slapped me with a $500 emergency compliance fine for aggressive behavior toward a resident, meaning Karen. That was the moment I decided this wasn't just about clearing my name. It was about dismantling the little empire she had built in my absence. I drafted my own letter, attaching the footage, the altered security logs, and the neighbor testimony, and sent it not to the HOA board directly, but to every single property owner in the community, all 86 of them. The subject line was simple: "This is who represents you," within hours. My inbox was flooded with replies, some shocked, some defensive, but many thanking me for finally calling her out. I knew from Mark that HOA board members could be removed by a vote if enough homeowners petitioned for it, and judging by the outrage pouring in, I was halfway there already. Karen must have gotten wind of my email blast because that evening she showed up at my gate, this time with 2 other board members in tow, demanding to set the record straight. I didn't even open the gate. I just held up my phone, hit record, and told them any further contact needed to go through my attorney. The expression on her face as the gate slowly closed again was worth every bit of the chaos so far. But I knew Karen. She wouldn't take this lying down. What I didn't know was just how far she was willing to go to turn the tables. And by the end of the week, she'd pull a stunt so outrageous it would force the entire HOA into damage control mode and give me the final push I needed to take her down for good. By the next morning, my plan to simply let the HOA and Karen trip over their own arrogance had been upgraded to full-blown counteroffensive, because at 6:42 a.m. my phone buzzed with an urgent community alert. Apparently Karen had filed a formal HOA violation against me, claiming that my landscaping was non-compliant with community standards and creating a hazard. The irony? My landscaping had been done by the HOA's own contracted gardener just before I left town. The attached photos in the violation notice were laughable. They showed my front hedge half dead, but I immediately recognized that the image had been taken weeks ago, during a temporary drought restriction period before my sprinklers had been adjusted. In other words, she was digging up old photos to fabricate a violation. I knew exactly why. She was trying to paint me as a problem homeowner to dilute the impact of my evidence against her. The problem for her was that I'd anticipated this sort of move. While traveling, I'd set up a third-party landscaping audit, a local company that visited every 2 weeks, took timestamp pictures, and emailed me a report. I pulled up the most recent one, dated just 2 days before I returned home, and it showed my yard looking pristine. So, instead of responding through the HOA portal, I forwarded the violation to the entire homeowner mailing list again, attaching my landscaping audit report and pointing out that filing false violations was, in fact, a breach of HOA bylaws. The ripple effect was immediate. I started getting BCCD on angry homeowner replies to the board, accusing them of corruption and bias. By lunchtime, Mark called to tell me that 3 homeowners had already requested a petition for a special meeting to remove Karen from the board. But Karen, true to form, doubled down. That same afternoon, she staged what can only be described as a performative safety inspection on my property, showing up with a clipboard, 2 HOA volunteers, and unbelievably a local news crew she had apparently called to document dangerous conditions. I had been working in my study when my security app pinged me with movement alerts, and when I checked the feed, there she was on my driveway, gesturing dramatically toward a loose garden hose as if it were a live wire. I didn't go outside. Instead, I called the sheriff's office again, explained that she was on my property without consent, and they dispatched a deputy. Watching the deputy arrive on my live feed was like watching the climax of a soap opera. Karen's confident posturing dissolved instantly into faux confusion as the deputy explained that, no, she had no authority to enter without my permission, and yes, she could be cited for trespassing. The camera caught the exact moment she spotted the security camera above the garage and realized this little stunt was going on my next community-wide email. That night, I decided to accelerate the timeline. Mark helped me draft a formal legal notice demanding that the HOA immediately suspend Karen from any enforcement actions pending investigation. And we sent it not only to the board, but also to the county HOA Oversight Committee, the local news tip line, and just for spice, the developer who still owned a portion of the unsold lots in the community. Developers hate bad PR, and I was counting on that. It worked faster than I imagined. The next morning, the board president himself called me, clearly rattled, asking if we could find a private resolution. I told him my terms were simple. Karen resigns, the HOA issues a written apology to all residents, and they reimburse me for every single expense related to her illegal occupancy, from the locksmith to the security audit. He sputtered something about overreach and legal review before hanging up. That was fine. I wasn't bluffing and they knew it. Then, right when I thought Karen might retreat, she made her boldest move yet. She called the police on me, claiming I was threatening her safety by publicly distributing private images, meaning the security footage of her in my home. 2 officers showed up at my door that evening, and for a split second, I wondered if she'd actually managed to twist the situation. But I invited them in, sat them down in front of my TV, and played the full, unedited footage of her living in my house without permission. They exchanged looks, and one of them actually laughed before saying, "Yeah, this isn't going anywhere." They left with a copy of the footage and assured me they'd be adding it to the active complaint file against her. By now, the tide in the community had fully shifted. Neighbors who had once politely ignored the HOA's overreach were now openly questioning every decision they made. Someone even started a private Facebook group called Take Back Our HOA, where residents shared stories of fines, harassment, and intimidation, and Karen's name came up in almost every thread. I joined quietly under my own name and posted my entire timeline of events with attached documents. Within hours, it had over 200 comments, many from people saying they'd support a recall vote. Karen must have been lurking in the group too, because the next morning, she left a handwritten note in my mailbox that simply read, "You think you've won, but you have no idea who you're dealing with." I laughed out loud when I read it, because at that point, I had every piece I needed to make sure she'd never hold a position of authority in the neighborhood again. What I didn't yet realize was that her final move would be so desperate, so self-incriminating, that it would effectively hand me the HOA's head on a platter and set the stage for the most satisfying takedown of my life. 2 days after receiving that melodramatic, "You have no idea who you're dealing with" note, I woke up to my phone buzzing like a hive of angry bees, multiple missed calls from Mark, 6 voicemails from neighbors, and 3 unread. Texts from numbers I didn't recognize, all saying some variation of, "Have you seen this?" When I finally opened the first message, it was a screenshot from the local news station's Facebook page, showing a headline that made my coffee almost come out of my nose. No, board member claims homeowner threatened her life in property dispute. And there she was, Karen, sitting in her living room, doing a trembling voice-acting performance for the camera about how I had menaced her with online mobs and was trying to drive her out of her own community. The clip was under 2 minutes, But it was pure theater. She talked about how frightened she was, how she was afraid to leave her house. And my personal favorite, how she was forced to live in my mansion because she was temporarily displaced after a burst pipe in her own home, and that I had generously offered her the space before turning on her. I almost admired her gall. She was spinning a full narrative out of thin air, banking on the fact that most viewers wouldn't know the actual legal and video evidence. But she made one crucial mistake. She claimed on record that she had my written consent to stay in my home. Within 15 minutes, I had clipped that part of the video, juxtaposed it with my police report and security footage showing her breaking the lockbox, and emailed it to the same news station's investigative reporter, politely suggesting they might want to fact-check before airing slander. Then I took it a step further. I posted the side-by-side on the Take Back Our HOA Facebook group, which was already in an uproar. The comments were instant and savage. Neighbors who had once been on the fence were now fully in my corner, openly calling for her resignation and asking for copies of the evidence. By noon, the news station had quietly pulled the video from their Facebook page, but the damage to Karen's credibility was already snowballing. That afternoon, Mark called to tell me the board had scheduled an emergency closed session to discuss personnel matters, which, in HOA speak, meant Karen's seat on the board was in real danger. But before they could even hold that meeting, Karen unleashed her final move. She filed a civil harassment restraining order against me, claiming I was stalking her and weaponizing social media to incite violence against her. She must have thought that dragging me into court would intimidate me into silence, but all it did was give me a public platform with legal weight to present every single piece of evidence I'd gathered. On the morning of the hearing, I walked into the courtroom with Mark at my side, carrying a neatly organized binder of timestamps, police reports, locksmith receipts, witness statements, and of course hours of security footage. Karen showed up alone, visibly rattled but still trying to keep her chin up, clutching a folder so thin it was almost comical. A judge gave her the floor first, and she launched into her well-rehearsed sob story until he interrupted to ask, "Do you have any physical evidence to support your claims?" She stammered, waved vaguely at her folder, and admitted she didn't. When it was my turn, I didn't just tell the story. I played it. I rolled security footage of her, lounging by my pool, sleeping in my bed, and hosting what appeared to be a small wine night with two of her friends in my kitchen. The courtroom was dead silent except for the occasional incredulous cough from someone in the back row. By the time I got to the footage of the deputy explaining trespassing laws to her on my driveway, Karen's face was the color of overripe tomatoes. When I finished, the judge didn't even take it under advisement. He dismissed her petition on the spot and, in a tone I can only describe as judicial side-eye, reminded her that filing knowingly false legal claims could have serious consequences. The local reporter I'd tipped off was in the back of the courtroom, and before I'd even driven home, the headline had flipped. HOA board member loses harassment case after video evidence shows unauthorized mansion stay. That was the death blow. That evening, the board president called me not to negotiate, but to inform me that Karen had voluntarily resigned and that the board would be issuing a statement acknowledging certain lapses in oversight. I told him I expected the reimbursement check by the end of the week, or the next story I pitched to the press would involve the board's role in enabling her behavior. 2 days later, the check arrived via courier, along with a letter that stopped short of an apology but admitted errors in judgment. Karen, meanwhile, disappeared from public view. Her house went dark. Her social media accounts vanished, and whispers started circulating that she'd moved in with family, out of state, to get away from the drama. But for me, it wasn't just about her resignation. It was about the shift in power. The Take Back Our HOA group swelled to half the neighborhood, and people were suddenly talking about revising the bylaws, demanding transparency, and even dissolving the HOA entirely. And every time someone brought up how it all started, they'd point at me, the guy who came home early and caught the queen of the HOA squatting in his mansion. But the truth was, it wasn't over. Karen's exit had left a mess in her wake, half-finished projects, unexplained expenses, and a board still full of people who had enabled her for years. Taking her down had been satisfying, yes, but the real work of cleaning up the HOA was just beginning, and I already had a plan to make sure no one like her ever sat in that chair again. With Karen out of the picture, you'd think life in the neighborhood would return to some kind of peaceful normalcy, but I quickly learned that cutting the head off the snake doesn't kill the whole thing. The body still writhes, and in this case, the body was the rest of the HOA board. A group of people who had either actively supported her antics or had been too cowardly to stop them. The first board meeting after her resignation was telling. The remaining members tried to brush the whole thing off as an unfortunate misunderstanding, which nearly made me laugh out loud, but I didn't show my hand yet. Instead, I quietly recruited the growing number of residents who were fed up with the way things had been run. Over the next several weeks, I dug into every single financial statement, meeting transcript, and project report from the last 5 years. What I found was a masterclass in shady accounting, inflated landscaping contracts, awarded to friends of certain board members, unexplained maintenance fees that never actually resulted in work being done, and repeated emergency assessments that mysteriously coincided with board members' home renovations. The more I uncovered, the more the neighborhood rallied. We began showing up to meetings en masse, not just to sit quietly, but to dominate the agenda, demand explanations, and record everything. The board didn't know how to handle a room full of people who weren't willing to nod and smile anymore. And then came the tipping point. In the bylaws, buried in legal jargon that most people never bothered to read, I found a clause that allowed for the removal of any board member with a 60% vote from the homeowners. I printed that clause on bright yellow flyers, distributed them door to door, and within a week, we had the signatures we needed to call a special election. The board tried to fight it, claiming procedural errors, but I had already spoken to a lawyer who specialized in HOA law, and he made it very clear that our petition was airtight. The night of the vote, the community center was standing room only, tension so thick you could cut it with a knife. One by one, the votes were counted, and when the dust settled, not a single original board member remained. The next morning, I was unanimously elected as the new board president, which was almost poetic, considering how hard Karen had worked to push me out of her HOA, but my plan wasn't to wield that power the way she had. It was to dismantle the machine. Altogether, over the next few months, we implemented transparency measures that made it impossible for anyone to sneak through contracts or assessments without community approval. We slashed unnecessary fees, canceled shady vendor agreements, and even refunded part of the last emergency assessment back to the homeowners. And then, in the biggest move of all, I spearheaded the effort to dissolve the HOA entirely, transferring common area management to a professional company that answered to us. Not the other way around. It was a long bureaucratic battle, but the day the HOA officially ceased to exist felt like a personal victory over every smug, power-drunk board member who had ever thought they could control people's lives because they happened to own a clipboard and a rulebook. As for Karen, I heard bits and pieces. Apparently she tried to run for the board in another community 2 towns over, but word of her antics here followed her like a shadow. One of my neighbors even forwarded me a screenshot from a Facebook group in that area, where residents were already warning each other about the woman who once got caught living in someone else's house. In the end, she became a cautionary tale, a name people used as shorthand for HOA corruption and arrogance. But for me, the real satisfaction came from walking through my own front door, seeing my home exactly as I left it, and knowing that no one, not Karen, not any HOA board member, not anyone, would ever again have the power to violate it. The neighborhood was quieter now, freer, and more neighborly without the constant shadow of HOA enforcement hanging over every fence and flower bed. Sometimes I'd sit on my porch in the evening, watching kids ride their bikes down the street without worrying about play equipment violations, or see a neighbor repaint their shutters whatever color they liked without fear of a fine. And I'd smile, because in the end,